All right, we are up to the French Revolution Goes Radical and our study of Unit 1, the Age of Revolution. So far, we've covered in this French Revolution section why the French Revolution happened to begin with, and then we also looked at some changes brought about by the Revolution, I should say. And now we're going to get into probably the most famous phase of the Revolution itself, when it goes really extremely violent and messy. And that's our topic for today. So let's describe how France changed during the radical phase of the French Revolution. So as a quick kind of recap of where we've been so far, the French Revolution began in July of 1789 with the storming of the Bastille, that fortress/prison in Paris. We also talked about how the royal family was brought back to Paris from Versailles during the Women's March. The royal family tried but failed to escape. They were basically virtual prisoners. And then we also talked about how France went to war because they felt as though their revolution was under threat. So, main idea number one. By the early 1790s, the French Revolution had entered a more radical, violent phase. A good example of this would come not even a year into the war. Not quite 3 years into the war. It's during September 1792. They're known as the so-called September Massacres. And by this point, the war was not going terribly well for the French. And there was real danger that Paris itself, would be invaded by foreign powers. And this was a city also on edge because many people who were seen as disloyal to the revolution had been arrested and put into prison. So you have a situation in which the prisons are basically overflowing with prisoners. The city itself looks vulnerable to an invasion. Things are really chaotic. And rumors start to fly that what's going to happen are these prisoners are going to rise up from the prisons. They're going to team up with those foreign invaders and seize control of the city and put the king back in his rightful place. So to prevent that from happening, angry Parisians stormed the prisons, killing some 1,200 or so of these prisoners, many of whom were just regular old prisoners, had nothing to do with the revolution at all, but they were basically in the wrong place at the wrong time. And if you look at the image, you can really see just the loss of control here, that people are really going off the deep end during the September Massacres. So let's go back and review a little bit. We learned that during the French Revolution, different political groups rose up, and one side of those political groups would have been the radicals, people like the Jacobins, people like the sans-culottes, and they wanted to replace the monarchy with a republic. So that means we have to abolish the monarchy. In September of 1792, the same month as the September Massacres, it was decided by the National Assembly to abolish the monarchy. To finally put a legal end to it and establish the French Republic. So if the monarchy has been established, the big question next is, what do we do with Louis XVI? He's no longer king. What should be done with him? And it was ultimately decided to put him on trial. Now this was a little controversial because there were a lot of moderates and conservatives in the French government and French Revolution who felt as though a constitutional monarchy would have been the better idea, or if you're going to end the monarchy, that's fine, but Louis himself should be perhaps exiled or put in prison or something. But in the trial, he's accused of treason among many other crimes, and he's convicted of treason by a single vote and sentenced to death. On January 21st, 1793, Louis was led from his cell to the place of his execution. You can see him right there arriving at the scaffold where the guillotine is waiting for him. And his final words as he addressed the crowd briefly was, "Frenchmen, I die innocent. I pardon the authors of my death. I pray that the blood about to be spilt will never fall upon the head of France." So Louis goes out with frankly forgiving and kind words, but the crowd shows no mercy, and he is executed, and there he is being shown off to the crowd. Now, you might be asking yourself, okay, if Louis was put to death, what about his wife, Marie Antoinette? Remember, she was the queen who had spent a lot of money. She was the one who built that fake peasant village on the grounds of Versailles. She's the one who supposedly told the crowds to eat cake when they were demanding bread. What to do with her? And prison had not been kind to Marie Antoinette. Her health had suffered greatly. She had lost a lot of weight. She aged rapidly. She was not in a good place. And she was found guilty, just like her husband, and sentenced to death. Like her husband, despite the fact that she's getting a lot of bad treatment, especially on the way to her execution, where people are throwing things at her, and spitting on her, and calling her all kinds of horrible names. Like her husband, she shows a remarkable sense of calm and dignity in her final moments. There she is being led away from the prison in an open cart, basically touring the city of Paris so people get to see her one last time. They can hurl some insults at her. And the story goes that her final words were an apology to the executioner for she accidentally stepped on his foot. And they are showing her off to the crowd. All right, so things have gotten pretty radical so far, but we're going to turn it up even a higher level here with something called the Committee of Public Safety. Now, with a name like the Committee of Public Safety, what would you expect the purpose of such an organization to be? Probably to keep the peace, right? To keep people safe. Not quite. That's not quite what's going to happen. So the Committee of Public Safety was established as a result of all those challenges France is facing from internal challenges to external challenges. So on the internal challenges, we would think of people fighting back against the revolution, of which there were people doing this. Obviously, bread prices are still high. There's economic problems. So those are internal challenges. Plus, political divisions. Those are all internal challenges. On the external challenges, we're thinking about the ongoing war, a war that, as I said a few moments ago, is not going well for France. So you put all those together, it was decided to give 12 men basically kind of executive authority to deal with all those challenges. Now, while there were 12 members to the Committee of Public Safety, the man who's going to turn out to have the most power and influence was a man named Maximillian Robespierre. Maximillian Robespierre is a guy who was absolutely 100% dedicated to the revolution. He had no life outside the revolution. He had virtually no friends, no family to speak of. He was just a man totally consumed by the revolution. In fact, he was so dedicated, people called him the incorruptible. He could not be corrupted. He decides that what's going to happen is really swift and drastic actions have to be taken to save the revolution, to save it from those who are deemed disloyal to the revolution. And that brings us to the most infamous phase of the French Revolution, what's known as the Reign of Terror. Reign, of course, means to rule, so terror is going to rule over France. This is the bloodiest, most radical phase of the French Revolution. So let's look at Robespierre, the architect of the terror, of the Reign of Terror. His idea was, by using violence and using terror and using drastic action, only through those things could a republic of virtue be established. Now, if virtue means good, in other words, if you're virtuous, you're a good person. And so to create this good republic, you had to basically sweep away all those who were not virtuous. He also wants to avoid a counter-revolution. A counter-revolution is a revolution against a revolution, and there were real dangers associated with this. France is basically undergoing a civil war in which groups are fighting back against the revolution, against the extreme measures taking place, particularly in this area over here known as the Vendée in western France. Robespierre, his famous quote was, as you can see at the bottom, liberty cannot be secured unless criminals lose their heads. So the Reign of Terror will last not quite a year, from September 1793 until July 1794. All told, about 300,000 people were going to be arrested If you are arrested, you don't have a lot of rights. In fact, eventually the Committee of Public Safety would even deny your access to a lawyer. So you're going to be charged with something. You'll have no defense, basically, which means there's a good chance you're going to be found guilty. Of the 300,000 that were arrested, some 17,000 were put to death. Now, the 17,000 would be the people actually taken out to the guillotine or shot or whatever. Thousands more died while in these horribly overcrowded and dirty prisons. Now, we had 3 estates, if you recall. The first estate was the clergy, the second was the nobility, and the third was basically everybody else. So of those 3 estates, which one would you expect accounted for most of the death? And the numbers might surprise you. It's not the first and second estate. It's the third estate. 2 things that this graph tells us. Number one, there was a lot of division within the third estate about how to pursue the French Revolution. And some of that division led to fighting and ultimately people being thrown in prison and beheaded for their beliefs. The second thing this graph tells us is, remember, 97% of the population was in the third estate, so it kind of makes sense that there's more people there being killed because there's simply more members of the third estate than anything else. Now, I've mentioned the word guillotine a couple of times. The guillotine was really an example of the Enlightenment. Remember, the Enlightenment was all about making the world better through reason and logic and science. And a man named Joseph Guillotin, who was a French doctor, invented this device as a humane, painless, and instant means of execution. And obviously, it's not something you could test in that sense, but by all thought, it really is an instant and painless death because the blade comes down, and well, there's not much there. There's no suffering that's going to happen. It's going to be instantaneous death. And the guillotine got the nickname the National Razor during the Reign of Terror because it was being used so often, and it really was being worked overtime. Now, I want you to imagine for a second you are in France at this time, and maybe you're a member of a political group, and you hear about all these people you're aware of being arrested and executed, and you fear you might be on the list to go next. So if you fear you might be next to be executed during the Reign of Terror, who do you have to eliminate to save yourself? And the answer, of course, is Robespierre. So after nearly a year of all these executions, other political factions began to break with Robespierre, calling for an end to the Reign of Terror. Robespierre refused to listen to these calls for mercy, and ultimately what's going to happen is people are going to turn on Robespierre, and he's going to be arrested, found guilty, and executed. And his death is the end of the Reign of Terror. So the great historical irony is the man who had sent so many people, thousands of people, to the guillotine ends at the guillotine himself. And again, that's basically the end of the Reign of Terror. All right, so in this lesson, we described how France changed during the radical phase of the French Revolution. We looked at things like the September Massacres, the trial and execution of the King and Queen of France. We looked at the Reign of Terror and the role of Robespierre, all big, radical, violent, bloody changes that occurred in France during this French Revolution. Now, we're not quite finished with the French Revolution yet, but we are getting very close to ending it, and also very close to talking about a person who came out of the French Revolution to lead France, and that, of course, is Napoleon Bonaparte.